Hey everybody, Maverick Christian here. This episode I'm going to talk about whether atheism is worth taking seriously. Among other things, talking about this video by Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity and some reactions that followed, like from Randall Rauser, also known as a Tentative Apologist. Part 1. The gist of what Capturing Christianity said. Cameron said that the strongest argument for atheism as far as he knows is the argument from evil.
Now, the best argument that atheists have, at least that I've found, is the problem of evil.
And that in his mind, this is a reason to not take atheism seriously.
The reason why I don't take atheism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the atheist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove atheism.
He thinks the argument from evil, the best argument for atheism, doesn't meaningfully support atheism.
What I'm saying is that the atheist's best argument doesn't come close to establishing atheism. Not even close. So even if we grant the atheist's strongest argument, it does not support atheism.
So Cameron was saying that the strongest argument for atheism is the argument from evil, and that the reason he doesn't take atheism seriously anymore is that even if we accept that argument, it wouldn't prove atheism. After all, there are versions of theism which conceive of more limited deities, such as God not being all-powerful. Part 2. Joe Schmid's excellent point. An example of more limited deity is that of Philip Goff, where God is morally good but not all-powerful. Philip Goff is the philosopher Cameron shows in this clip.
But so why doesn't the problem of evil establish atheism? Well, simply because there are many other kinds of gods that it doesn't rule out. The British philosopher Philip Goff is a really good example of someone that adopts a sort of non-standard view of God.
So we're in a situation where the believers are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain suffering. The atheists are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning, when in fact, there are middle ground options that can elegantly account for both of these data points. Consider, for example, the hypothesis of a God of limited power, a God who's made the best universe they can. Maybe God simply can't create complex life in an instant. Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a universe with the right physics that is eventually going to evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I'm sorry, I know it's going to be messy. This is all I can do, is this or nothing. I think this hypothesis can account for both the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and the suffering in terms of God's limitations.
So even though God is all good, perfectly benevolent on this view, given his limit in power, there's no way that he can stop all of the suffering in the world. What I want you to notice here, and this is really important, the problem of evil, which is once again one of the atheist's best arguments, doesn't touch this particular view of God that we just went over. It doesn't touch it at all.
Joe Schmid is an excellent philosopher who has a YouTube channel called Majesty of Reason. In his video response, which I'll link to below, he brought up one particularly good point among many other points. Borrowing largely from that Joe Schmid video, consider the data this deity is accounting for when it comes to teleological and cosmological arguments. This deity created the entire universe and printed ubiquitous mathematical algorithms into it that we call physical laws, and fine-tuned the parameters of the universe he created so that it would be life-permitting. Even if this being isn't strictly omnipotent, such a being of enormous power for creating and manipulating physical reality on that scale would still seem to make the problem of evil very relevant here if we're to suppose this deity is morally good. There are even more arguments we could add to this, like the argument from moral knowledge and the argument from psychophysical harmony, which make it clear that if the deity in question isn't omnipotent, it's pretty darn close to it. So the idea that the argument from evil doesn't touch this deity at all doesn't seem quite accurate, at least not if we're using the teleological argument, the cosmological argument, and so forth, and Philip Goff seems to allude to those things when he talks about the fine-tuning and creation of the universe. With that said, I can give a bit of pushback to Joe Schmid's excellent point. One way to deal with the argument from evil is to say that God isn't perfectly good in the same way that we humans understand goodness. To explain this, some philosophical concepts are useful here. Terms can be univocal, equivocal, or analogical. A term is used univocally when it has the same meaning, for example, the word green in a green ball and a green couch. A term is used equivocally when the meanings are entirely different, for example, the word pool in a game of pool and a pool of water. A term is used analogically if the meanings are different but analogous, for example, the word see in I see a tree and I see that 2 + 2 = 4. One could say that God is good in an equivocal sense, or stronger still, say that God isn't good but instead say that God is not evil, Apophatic theology is about describing God by just saying what God is not, rather than saying what God is. So an apophatic theologian might say that we should say that God is not evil, rather than say that God is good, because to call God good would be to limit his goodness to what it means for human behavior to be good. Alternatively, one might say that goodness is an analogical predicate of God. That is, it's significantly similar to our understanding of goodness, but not quite the same. And that, comparable to what the aforementioned apophatic theologian might say, we shouldn't call God good in a univocal sense because that would be inaccurately equating it to what it means for non-God things to be good. Such views of God could, at least in principle, depending on the details, obviate the argument from evil for an omnipotent or near omnipotent God. For example, the argument from evil wouldn't work very well against a deity who adopts a standard of goodness that is similar in some respects to our standard of goodness, but is nonetheless such that God would permit all the evil and suffering that exists in our world. Perhaps because God's analogical standard of goodness is such that, among other things, it's good that God allows humanity to strive against the challenges and sufferings in earthly life. Also, a theist who views God being good in an analogical sense might believe that the observed suffering is finite and that it all works out in the end with an infinitely long and pleasant afterlife. With God providing that pleasant afterlife being one factor for God's goodness being at least somewhat similar to ours, even if not entirely like how we would ordinarily understand goodness. Joe Schmid could undoubtedly give objections to the existence of a God who is equivocally or analogically good. My point here is just that there are ways for the theist who believes in an enormously powerful God to obviate the problem of evil using a different conception of God while still being at least somewhere in the ballpark of ascribing moral goodness to God. At any rate, my main conclusions for this part are these. Even if we limit a cosmically powerful God's potency so that he isn't strictly omnipotent, the problem of evil is still relevant, at least if we use the term goodness in its univocal sense. If, however, we use goodness in an equivocal or analogical sense, the argument from evil against God could potentially be circumvented, depending on the details. Part 3. The Tentative Apologist. Randall Rouser, also known as the Tentative Apologist, had multiple responses to Cameron. I'm something of a fan of his, just as I'm something of a fan of captured Christianity, but that doesn't mean I always agree with either person. As this video will make clear, I disagree with both of them on certain things, though I like both of them. A couple good points the Tentative Apologist makes are those regarding precision when it comes to not taking atheism seriously and the argument from evil not proving atheism.
There are a couple huge problems, in my view, straight out of the gate. Cameron, in his analysis, doesn't tell us how he defines taking seriously, and he also doesn't tell us what he means by proof.
Fair point. With that said, here's how I interpreted Cameron. Taking atheism seriously means taking it as a serious threat to the truth of Christianity such that it's something that would cause significant doubt in his mind. Cameron believes that the case for atheism doesn't carry enough evidence for that.
Cameron, yeah, he's been studying this stuff for 10 years. He should know that precise language matters, and that if you use ambiguous language, that is a way of guarding your analysis from critical rebuttal because people don't even know at the outset what you are claiming. I can't help but wonder if Cameron's use of not taking seriously, is that just a form of clickbait? Is that a way to be ambiguous intentionally about guarding his claims from rebuttal? Or is that just a carelessness of analysis? I'm not sure what is going on here.
I can think of a somewhat different possibility. Namely, Cameron isn't a philosopher and doesn't have formal philosophical training like Randall Rouser and I do. And largely as a result of this, he was using a kind of ordinary level of precision when talking to his lay audience. We don't always use a high level precision when using lay people language. Consider, for example, this objection.
So what does he mean by proof? Does he mean it wouldn't provide a logical proof for atheism, which would be a valid deductive argument with logically compelling premises? If that's what he's requiring of the atheist, of course, the immediate rebuttal is, do you have a proof for theism? Do you have a logically compelling deductive argument whose premises can only be denied on pain of contradiction and irrationality for theism? And if not, why are you holding the atheist to the standard that you don't apply to yourself? A lesser form of proof, there are actually 5 lesser forms of proof in criminal law. There is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So is this what Cameron is meaning, that the problem of evil wouldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that atheism is true? And if so, why would he expect that high standard of atheism? And does he have proof beyond a reasonable doubt for Christian theism? Again, I would wonder, uh, why doesn't Cameron clarify this?
Fair point. There are multiple ways to interpret the word proof, like he said, and criminal law does have multiple standards of proof. It would have been better for Cameron to clarify what he meant by prove, but we also have to bear in mind that Cameron is a layperson talking to his lay audience, and that in ordinary conversation, we typically don't hold each other to these standards of precision. For example, if I say, the evidence proves that a certain politician lied about something, I'm not going to be grilled about which of the manifold different standards of evidence in criminal law that I'm using. That would seem awfully pedantic. Now, I'm not saying the tentative apologist doesn't have a point here in wanting greater precision than what lay people ordinarily use. I just think there are limits to how good a point that is when we're dealing with a non-philosopher talking to his lay audience, and who hasn't had the formal training in philosophy. Speaking of which, as someone with formal training in philosophy, I really wanted to comment on this part in his video.
I am reminded here of the invisible gardener. So this was a parable originally told by a philosopher named John Wisdom, and then it was made famous by Antony Flew in the early 1950s. I think it was 1952, in an essay called Theology and Falsification, if memory serves. The basic story is familiar to many of us who study philosophy of religion. If you're not familiar with it, it goes roughly like this. Two men are walking in the woods. They come upon a clearing. One man says that there is a gardener who tends the clearing. The other man is skeptical, says, I don't believe there is any gardener. So they agree to wait and see if there is a gardener. And they wait a long time and no gardener appears. So the second man feels vindicated that there is, in fact, no gardener. But the first man says, well, the gardener is invisible. So he's now adjusted his hypothesis to account for the evidence against it, and he thereby can retain belief in the gardener. So the second fellow says, okay, an invisible gardener, is it? Let's test that. And so he proposes that they put a fence around the garden, around the clearing, to see if, to keep any gardener out. And sure enough, there's no evidence of a gardener after the fence is put up. So the first fellow says, well, actually, the gardener can pass through fences. It quickly becomes clear to the second individual that this hypothesis of a gardener can be endlessly adapted for whatever counter evidence might be proffered against it. And thus, it is not so much that he can falsify the hypothesis, rather, it has become unfalsifiable and it's to him no longer interesting. Now, the lesson that Antony Flew wanted to draw in the mid 20th century, still coming out of a hangover of logical positivism, was that if a hypothesis cannot be falsified, then it's not to be taken seriously.
This crossover is simplification and misleading because one might be given the impression from the tentative apologist that Antony Flew's lesson is that if the assertion that God exists cannot be falsified, it's not to be taken seriously. But that was not Antony Flew's lesson. Antony Flew did not say or even imply that if the assertion that God exists cannot be falsified, it's not to be taken seriously. Flew instead made the very different and far more radical claim that the utterance God exists is not an assertion at all. Now, if God exists not being an assertion sounds crazy to you, that's because it is. I don't think it makes any sense. To be clear, I'm not saying Randall Rouser intended to mislead his audience, but I fear those without the benefit of studying philosophy might in fact be misled about the point of Antony Flew's invisible gardener illustration. Ironically, the tentative apologist himself wasn't being terribly precise here when talking to his lay audience.
But then this is where it gets interesting. So then Cameron says that I'm incorrect. He says that atheism means there are no gods. So what he's trying to argue is that the atheist is overreaching because they affirm, like, let's say they justify atheism based on the problem of evil. But the problem of evil only justifies atheism, it only justifies belief in a particular subset of beings that may be called God. And so it actually doesn't justify atheism. It only justifies disbelief in a morally perfect, all-powerful being, for example. That's the nature of the artist, what he's trying to argue. But again, I don't find that, I think actually he's mistaken there in the way that he's framing it, or at least there's a confusion in the way that he's presenting things. So I said, Cameron, you're just wrong, not every atheist, or every person who calls themselves an atheist, means to deny the existence of every entity affirmed by every person who identifies as a theist.
For example, suppose a theist's conception of God is just the universe, or being itself, and both the universe and being itself are understood in mundane, non-supernatural ways that any atheist would accept. For example, when the theist that calls the universe God doesn't think the universe is a supernatural conscious entity, but merely instead that part of reality that the natural sciences affirm. In that case, the atheist who accepts the existence of the universe obviously wouldn't deny the universe, they would just say that this type of universe doesn't qualify as a deity. So who's right here? Caption Christianity or the tentative apologist? Well, they're kind of both right. Caption Christianity isn't wrong to say that atheism is view that there are no gods, and the tentative apologist is at least partly right, since the atheist isn't going to deny the existence of the universe in its mundane and scientifically understood sense. The atheist will instead have to limit their atheism to only certain conceptions of God. I think the problem here is that people are talking past each other a bit. When Cameron implied that atheism isn't always denial of a specific concept of theism, I think he had in mind the ordinary sense of the word deity in theism, such that it includes things like Zeus or Yahweh, but would not include things like the mundane non-supernatural universe. It's just that the atheists would disagree over semantics when denying the mundane non-supernatural universe as God. That point over semantics would make this part true, but then it wouldn't really be disagreeing with anything Caption Christianity said in his original video. Which is not to say that there aren't other legitimate objections to that video, which I'll deal with next with my own objections. Part 4, my objections. Disclaimer, although I don't always agree with everything he puts out on his channel, I do think Caption Christianity puts out some good content. The same goes for the Tentative Apologist, as I alluded to earlier. So I don't want to give the impression that I don't appreciate much of the work, but I do. With that said, Cameron said that the strongest argument for atheism is the argument from evil, and I don't think it's anywhere near the strongest argument. Largely because, as Cameron said in his video, it doesn't attack theism in general. There is a much better argument for atheism that does attack theism in general, and it's one that makes me less certain of my theism than I otherwise would be. So, I'll put on my atheist hat, and before I start making my case, I'll begin with an illustration. Suppose I say there's an invisible unicorn floating above my head. This claim is possible but not plausible, and you'd be justified in disbelieving it. The reason is that invisible unicorns diverge wildly from the types of things we know exist, and when that happens, we give the existence of such things a very low probability. We don't take seriously the existence of invisible unicorns. Similarly, we don't take the existence of fairies, leprechauns, or Zeus as a serious possibility. So, to be consistent rational thinkers, we should adopt the same attitude towards deities in general. So, that's it in a nutshell. I think this argument, or something like it, is a big reason why a lot of people are atheists. Is atheism worth taking seriously? I think in a few ways the answer is yes. First, there are arguments for atheism worth taking seriously. For example, the presumption of atheism argument I put forward using the invisible unicorn analogy is a significant challenge for the theist to overcome. I think it can be overcome, but it's not immediately obvious how to overcome it, at least not for most people. Most people don't have a strong apologetics background in this area after all. There are also other arguments for atheism, some of which Schmid talked about, link in the description below. A second sense in which I think atheism is worth taking seriously is atheistic challenges to theistic arguments. Technically, you could be a theist and challenge these arguments, but atheist philosophers tend to have a stronger motive to do so, and some of these challenges are philosophically interesting enough to be worth responding to. A similar point applies to challenges to traditional theism like the argument from evil. Even if they don't prove atheism, they are worth taking seriously. To be fair to Cameron Bertuzzi, I think these senses in which I think we should take atheism seriously aren't necessarily inconsistent with him not taking atheism seriously in his sense of the phrase. After all, he could believe that the evidence strongly favors at least some kind of theism, such that the evidence for atheism isn't strong enough to create substantial doubt in his mind, while also acknowledging that we should take atheism seriously in the senses I described. I do agree that the evidence strongly favors theism when theism is understood in its broad sense. But I also think there's a sense in which atheism and its challenges are worth taking seriously. Well, and about wrap it up. This is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.